He thought he could attack a defenseless woman with impunity. But suddenly, Chuck Norris appeared. What happened next amazed everyone. Subscribe, and what city are you watching from? Write in the comments. The city was alive with the rhythmic chaos of the evening rush. Neon lights flickered against wet pavement, reflecting a spectrum of colors that danced between the passing cars. The distant hum of traffic merged with the occasional honk of a horn, a siren wailing somewhere far off in the labyrinth of buildings. Pedestrians weaved through one another, some in a hurry, others lost in the glow of their phone screens. Among them, moving slower than the rest, was Emily. Her hand rested protectively on the curve of her stomach as she walked, each step careful, deliberate. The weight of exhaustion pressed on her shoulders, her body sluggish from the long day. She had left work later than usual and now found herself alone, threading through the thinning crowd towards the bus stop. Despite the noise and movement around her, something unsettled her. A creeping sensation prickled at the back of her neck, a feeling of being watched. She cast a quick glance over her shoulder, but the street behind her looked normal. People passed in their usual hurry, the city swallowing them as they disappeared into doorways and subway entrances. Still, the feeling didn't leave. She took a deep breath and continued walking, but the awareness of something wrong grew stronger. It was subtle at first, footsteps slightly out of sync with the rest of the city's rhythm. They weren't hurried like those of a late commuter, nor aimless like a casual stroller. These steps followed a deliberate pace. Her pulse quickened. Maybe it was paranoia, a trick of the mind brought on by fatigue. But her instincts screamed otherwise. She reached a crosswalk and hesitated, letting a group of pedestrians pass in front of her. As they moved by, she turned her head slightly, scanning the street in her periphery. That's when she saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of controlled arrogance that made her stomach tighten. His uniform was unmistakable, the dark blue of the city police, the badge catching the glow of the streetlights. The name tag read Grayson. Emily's breath hitched. She didn't know him personally, but she knew his reputation. Everyone in this part of the city did. Officer Grayson was the kind of cop people spoke about in hushed voices. His name surfaced in rumors, whispers of unnecessary force, of people stopped without reason, of bruises left unseen beneath sleeves and collars. But nothing ever stuck. He was the law, and the law didn't answer to shadows. And now he was following her. She forced herself to keep walking, her heart beat a rapid drum in her ears. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just heading the same way, but her body knew better. Ahead, she saw an alley, narrow, dark, leading to a side street that would get her to the bus stop faster. It was risky, but she was running out of options. If he was truly following her, it was better to confirm it now rather than later, when she was completely alone. She made a sharp turn into the alley. Her footsteps echoed against the brick walls. The smell of damp concrete and distant garbage filled the air. A single flickering street lamp cast long, jagged shadows against the pavement. Silence. She exhaled shakily. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe. The heavy crunch of a boot against the ground shattered the quiet. She spun around, and there he was. Officer Grayson stood at the mouth of the alley, his presence blocking any escape back to the main street. The dim lighting cast sharp angles over his face, making his features look even harder, crueler. His mouth twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't random. He had been waiting for a moment like this. Her body screamed at her to run, but before she could react, he was moving. A single, heavy stride closed the distance between them. His hand shot out, fingers clamping down on her shoulder with bruising force. Emily gasped, her knees nearly buckling under the weight of his grip. Then he shoved her. It wasn't just a push, it was a statement, a reminder of his strength, of his control. The force sent her stumbling backward, and before she could catch herself, her foot caught on uneven pavement. She fell hard. The impact jolted through her body, her hands instinctively flying to protect her stomach as she hit the cold ground. A sharp pain shot through her elbow, but it was nothing compared to the panic grip in her chest. She could taste blood. Her lip must have split when she hit the pavement. The coppery tang mixed with the growing nausea in her stomach. The world spun for a moment, her vision swimming with the dull glow of the street lamp overhead. Above her, Grayson loomed. His shadow stretched over her like a predator's, his posture relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. He didn't look worried. He didn't look nervous. If anything, he looked amused. Emily tried to scramble backward, but her body refused to move properly. She had never felt so vulnerable, so utterly powerless. Somewhere beyond the alley, life continued as if nothing was happening. The city kept moving, oblivious. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. The panic set in fully now, drowning her thoughts. No one was coming to help her. No one was going to stop him. And Grayson knew it. Pain radiated through Emily's body as she struggled to regain control of her breath. The impact of the fall had left her momentarily stunned, her limbs heavy, her thoughts sluggish. Her hands still clutched her stomach, a desperate, instinctive attempt to protect the life growing inside her. But as she looked up at the looming figure before her, she knew this had nothing to do with her pregnancy. This was about something else entirely. Grayson didn't move immediately. He just stood there, watching her with a slow, measured amusement. The way a cat watches a mouse after it has already decided the outcome. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. She knew how these stories ended. She had read the headlines, heard the testimonies whispered in community meetings. She knew the type of man Grayson was, not just a bully, not just an abuser of power, but something worse. A predator who hid behind a badge, who knew that people feared him too much to fight back. And here, in this darkened alleyway, away from the crowd, he had her exactly where he wanted. She forced herself to move, pushing up onto one elbow, her other hand still pressed protectively over her stomach. Grayson's boot shifted just slightly. A warning. She froze. His hand hovered near his belt, fingers tapping lazily against the handle of his baton. The movement was casual, almost distracted, but she wasn't naive enough to mistake it for anything less than deliberate. This was a game to him. Her fingers scraped against the rough concrete as she tried to push herself up further. Her elbow throbbed where she had landed on it, a dull, spreading ache. The silence around them was suffocating. Beyond the alley, the city still moved. Cars honked, voices laughed, the distant rhythm of life continuing as if nothing was happening. But here, in this narrow stretch of darkness, time had slowed. Emily's breathing was shallow, erratic. She willed herself to think, to do something, anything, but the fear sat like a weight on her chest. She glanced towards the mouth of the alley. The street beyond wasn't far. If she could just get to her feet. Grayson sighed, tilting his head slightly as if reading her thoughts. Then, without warning, he moved. A single step forward. The shift in power was instantaneous. He wasn't just standing over her now. He was above her, closer, his presence crushing. Emily's muscles locked. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but her body refused to cooperate, paralyzed by the sharp, electric current of terror running through her veins. Grayson crouched slightly, resting his hands on his knees as he studied her. His expression was unreadable, but the gleam in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He enjoyed this. She had heard stories about him before, tales of people, mostly women, who had been cornered, threatened, humiliated. But those stories had always seemed distant, like something that happened to other people. Now, she was living one. And just like in those stories, she could already see the ending. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A man walking past the alley, his gaze briefly flicking in their direction. Emily's heart leapt. She opened her mouth, desperate to call out, but before she could, Grayson shifted his weight and his hand dropped to his baton. He didn't even have to draw it. The simple motion, the unspoken, "Don't even try it," was enough to make the passerby hesitate. Just for a second. And that was all it took. The man turned his head away, kept walking. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She watched the figure retreat, his silhouette swallowed by the bustling street beyond. She wanted to scream after him, to beg for help. But the words wouldn't come, and even if they did, she knew they would be ignored. Because this was how it always happened. People saw, they always saw, but they never interfered. Fear was a disease in this city. It spread through the streets, seeped into the cracks of sidewalks, nestled in the walls of apartment buildings. It lived in the whispered warnings exchanged between neighbors and the unspoken understanding that some fights weren't worth getting involved in. And men like Grayson thrived in that silence. The baton tapped against his palm now, a slow, rhythmic beat against the thick leather of his gloves. He was waiting. For what, she didn't know. Maybe for her to make the next move. Maybe just to watch her squirm. Her fingers curled into fists against the pavement. Her body screamed at her to do something. But what could she do? He was bigger, stronger, armed. And her? She was alone. The fear in her chest twisted into something colder, a slow, creeping realization. This wasn't just about him wanting to hurt her. This was about power, and right now he had all of it. The breath hitched in her throat as he took another step forward, the rubber sole of his boot scraping against the pavement. No one was coming. No one was going to stop him. And he knew it. The city had no eyes. It moved, breathed, lived, but it did not see. It did not care. People passed by on the sidewalk outside the alley, their faces illuminated by the glow of street lights and neon signs. They laughed, talked, checked their phones, never once turning to acknowledge the darkened space between the buildings where a woman lay on the ground, trembling. Emily was trapped in that blindness, in the cold, unfeeling void where only those who suffered could see clearly. Grayson knew it. He stood over her, his baton tapping methodically against his gloved palm, a slow, menacing rhythm. There was no urgency in his posture, no fear of consequences. He had all the time in the world, and he wanted her to know it. Emily tried to push herself up again, but her limbs felt sluggish, her body unresponsive. The shock of the fall had rattled her, and fear did the rest. She had never felt so utterly helpless. She had no weapon, no means to fight back, and even if she screamed, who would listen? Who would risk stepping in? Grayson shifted his weight, boots scraping against the concrete. He took a slow step forward, and the air seemed to grow heavier, the alley shrinking around her. His shadow stretched long and jagged under the flickering street lamp, swallowing hers whole. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She had to do something, anything, But as she tensed, forcing herself to move, something changed. A ripple in the air, a shift in the silence. The rhythm of the city stuttered. The tapping of the baton stopped. Grayson's head turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge what Emily had already felt. A presence. Someone was watching. At first, it was unclear who. The street outside was still full of people, but none of them were looking. No one had stopped. But then she saw him. A man. Not just any man, a figure that seemed to materialize from the crowd, emerging from the sea of indifferent faces like something carved from stone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply in dark jeans, a plain shirt, and a faded denim jacket. His presence wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, but it was there, filling the space around him in a way that was impossible to ignore. His posture was relaxed, but there was nothing casual about it. His steps were measured, deliberate, the kind of walk that did not belong to a man uncertain of his place in the world. He did not belong to the blind city. He had eyes, and he had seen. Emily could barely process the shift in the air as he crossed the street, stepping onto the sidewalk without hurry, without hesitation. He didn't weave through the crowd. The crowd moved for him. Even those who weren't looking at him seemed to sense something, an unspoken command in his presence. The gap between him and the rest of the world widened with each step. Grayson turned fully now, his shoulders squaring as he studied the approaching man. The baton in his hand stilled, fingers tightening around the handle. He knew, as Emily did, that this man was different. Not a bystander, not a witness, a force. And he was coming straight for them. Grayson shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his grip on the baton, his expression flickering between irritation and something else. Caution. Emily's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. She couldn't tell if this man was here to help her, or if he was just another piece in a game she didn't understand. But something in the way he moved told her. This was not a man who ignored things. He reached the entrance of the alley and stopped. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The neon glow from the street barely touched his face, but his eyes, dark, unreadable, were fixed on Grayson. No words were spoken. None were needed. The shift in power was instant. Emily felt it before Grayson did, the way the space around them changed, the way the very weight of the air adjusted itself. It was the unspoken law of predators, the moment when one recognized another. Grayson's jaw tightened. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. But he was aware. And that was something. The man in the denim jacket took another step forward, closing the last bit of space between them. He didn't break eye contact, didn't flinch. Grayson inhaled through his nose, slow, measured. He was calculating. Could he get away with this? Could he still win? Emily saw the answer in his stance. He wasn't backing down. But neither was the man who had come for him. Something told her this was about to end very, very differently than Grayson had planned. The alley was silent, but not empty. The city still breathed beyond it, the rhythm of life undisturbed by the moment unfolding in its shadows. A car horn blared somewhere in the distance, followed by the distant chatter of pedestrians spilling out of a bar. But in this narrow corridor between buildings, time had stretched, thickened, wrapped itself around the two men standing at its center. Emily felt like an observer in her own nightmare, watching as the stranger and Grayson faced each other in the dim light. She had never seen a man like this before. Someone who could step into a space and shift the balance of power with nothing more than his presence. He hadn't spoken a word, yet Grayson had already squared his shoulders, muscles tensing beneath his uniform. The baton in Grayson's hand, once tapping with casual arrogance, was now still. His fingers curled tighter around it, knuckles whitening as he measured the situation. Emily could almost hear the calculations running through his mind, the way his gaze flicked over the stranger's frame, taking in his size, his stance, the way he carried himself. The man in the denim jacket remained motionless, but there was nothing passive about him. His posture was loose, his weight balanced, every muscle primed for movement. He was waiting. Not with hesitation, but with patience. The kind of patience that belonged to someone who had been in situations like this before, who had seen men like Grayson and had already decided how this would end. For the first time since the encounter began, a sliver of unease flickered in Grayson's expression. It was there and gone in an instant, smothered beneath years of arrogance and unchecked authority. But Emily had seen it. And so had the stranger. The moment stretched until Grayson, unwilling to let the control slip from his grasp, made his choice. He moved first. It happened fast. 1 second, the alley was thick with tension. The next, Grayson lunged forward, swinging the baton in a sharp downward arc. The air whistled with the force of it, a strike meant to cripple, to shatter bone if it connected. It didn't. The stranger sidestepped at the last moment, his movement fluid and effortless, as if he had anticipated the attack before it even began. The baton sliced through empty air, and in the fraction of a second it took for Grayson to recover, the counterstrike came. A fist drove into his solar plexus with precise, unrelenting force. The impact was brutal. A hollow, sickening sound followed as the air left Grayson's lungs in a sharp gasp. His body jerked, doubling over instinctively, his grip on the baton loosening for just a moment. But the stranger didn't stop there. A second blow followed, this one to the ribs, controlled, deliberate, not wild, not rushed. It landed with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to hit and how much force to use. Grayson staggered backward, his boots scuffing against the concrete, his face twisting in pain. Emily barely breathed. She had seen fights before, street scuffles, drunken brawls outside clubs, but this was different. This wasn't a chaotic flurry of fists and rage. This was something calculated. The man in the denim jacket was not a man who fought for sport. He was a man who fought to end things. Grayson snarled, his pride wounded more than his body. He recovered fast, too fast for someone who had just taken 2 direct blows. He was strong, that much was clear. He had spent years throwing his weight around, using his size and training to dominate those weaker than him. But for the first time, he wasn't the strongest one here. He adjusted his stance, gripping the baton in both hands now, realizing that underestimating this man had been a mistake. His next attack was more measured, more controlled. He swung low, aiming for the stranger's knee, a move designed to cripple an opponent before they could retaliate. Again, it missed. This time, the stranger didn't just dodge. He stepped into the attack. His hand snapped out, catching Grayson's wrist mid-swing. A heartbeat later, he twisted. The motion was sharp, precise, a maneuver meant to disarm. Grayson grunted, his grip faltering as pain jolted up his arm. The baton clattered to the ground, skidding across the pavement. Emily felt something shift in the air, something final. Grayson tried to yank his arm free, but the stranger held firm. A second later, he moved again, stepping in closer, using his own body weight to flip Grayson off balance. The officer hit the ground hard. His back slammed against the concrete, his breath leaving him in a stunned exhale. For a moment, he lay there, chest rising and falling rapidly, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The stranger stepped over him, looking down with an expression that was unreadable, calm in a way that sent a different kind of fear crawling up Emily's spine. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't reveling in victory. He was simply done. Grayson rolled onto his side, groaning, his face contorted in pain and fury. His hand twitched toward his belt, toward the gun holstered there. A single, sharp movement cut him off. The stranger's boot came down, not on his hand, but beside it, firm enough to send a warning through the ground beneath them. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. Don't. Grayson froze. For the first time since this encounter began, real fear entered his eyes. Emily exhaled shakily, the adrenaline making her limbs feel weak. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if Grayson would try again, if he would take the humiliation and turn it into something worse later. But she knew one thing. Tonight, for the first time, he had lost. And someone had finally made him feel powerless. The stranger stepped back, lifting his foot from where it had been planted near Grayson's hand. He didn't look at Emily. He didn't say a word. He simply turned, his movements as unhurried as they had been when he arrived. He walked away, back toward the mouth of the alley, disappearing into the street beyond. The fight was over, but something told Emily this was far from the end. The sound of Grayson's heavy breathing filled the alley, a jagged, uneven rasp as he lay sprawled on the ground. The fight had left him winded, stripped of the power he had carried so effortlessly just moments ago. His fingers twitched against the concrete, curling into a fist as if gripping at the last remnants of control. His pride was wounded deeper than his body, and that was a pain he wasn't accustomed to feeling. Emily had not moved. She remained where she had fallen, watching as the scene before her shifted in a way she never could have anticipated. The stranger had stepped away from Grayson, his back turned, his silhouette a stark contrast against the faint glow from the street beyond the alley. He did not gloat. He did not taunt. He simply left as if what had just transpired required no further action. And maybe, for him, it didn't. Grayson, however, was not done. A low growl of frustration rumbled from his chest as he pushed himself up, his limbs trembling slightly from the strain of the blows he had taken. His face was twisted with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck stood out. He was not used to losing, not used to being on the receiving end of the kind of violence he so often inflicted. Emily saw the moment his mind shifted, the moment survival turned to revenge. His hand moved toward his belt, fingers grazing the holster at his side. Even in his weakened state, even with the weight of defeat pressing down on him, he was still a man with a weapon. But the stranger had not left yet. The moment Grayson reached for his gun, the man in the denim jacket turned. His movement was unhurried, controlled, but his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, locked onto Grayson with an intensity that froze the officer in place. It was not fear that stopped him. It was the undeniable certainty that if he continued, the consequences would be swift and absolute. Grayson's fingers hesitated just above the holster, trembling in indecision. His breath came fast, sharp, his rage battling against something more primal, an instinct that told him he was no longer in control of this situation. The stranger took a single step forward. That was all it took. Grayson's hand dropped away from his belt, his lips curling in frustration. He wanted to fight back, wanted to reclaim the dominance he had lost, but some part of him, some deep, animalistic part, understood that he had already lost. There was no salvaging this, Not now. The stranger said nothing. He did not have to. Emily felt the weight of it in the air, the unspoken finality of the moment. She could see it in the way Grayson's shoulders slumped just slightly, his pride warring with the reality of his position. He could push further, could force this into something worse, but he would not walk away from it unscathed. And Grayson was a man who had never truly known consequence. Until now. A murmur stirred at the entrance of the alley. The crowd that had once ignored the unfolding scene had begun to change. Eyes that had previously averted were now fixed on the aftermath, drawn by something undeniable. Phones were out, cameras recording, the glow of their screens capturing evidence that would not be buried. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. For the first time, the city saw. Grayson must have felt it too. He turned his head slightly, his gaze darting toward the figures gathering at the edges of the alley. Some stood in quiet disbelief, others murmured among themselves, but none of them moved to intervene, not because they were afraid, but because they had already chosen a side, and it was not his. A flicker of something passed through his eyes, realization perhaps, or the bitter taste of inevitability. Then came the sound. Distant at first, barely a murmur against the city's constant hum. But then it grew, sharp, distinct, sirens. Grayson's expression darkened. His body tensed as he looked toward the street, toward the approaching blue and red lights that reflected off the wet pavement. The approaching reality of what had just happened settled over him, and for the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Emily could hardly believe it. He was going to be held accountable. The stranger remained still, watching, but making no move to stay. He had done what needed to be done. His presence had shifted the tides, had tilted the balance away from men like Grayson and toward something closer to justice. But he had no intention of waiting to see how it ended. He turned again, this time with finality, and walked toward the mouth of the alley. His steps were as steady as they had been when he arrived, unaffected by the weight of what had just transpired. He was leaving. Grayson saw it too, and for a brief moment, something desperate flickered in his expression. He wanted to call out, to demand something, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. Nothing he could do to undo what had already been set in motion. The crowd parted as the stranger stepped onto the sidewalk, blending into the city as seamlessly as he had emerged from it. He was gone. Emily barely had time to process it before the police arrived. The cruisers skidded to a halt at the curb, doors bursting open as uniformed officers spilled into the street. Their radios crackled, hands hovering near their holsters, ready for anything. But what they found was not a riot. Not chaos. They found their own. Grayson, bloodied and on the ground, his reputation shattered in the cold light of the street lamps. The scattered pieces of his authority lay around him, unseen but undeniable. One of the officers stepped forward, glancing between Grayson and the gathering crowd, then toward Emily, who still sat against the wall, shaken but alive. What happened here? The words came, but no one answered immediately. Not because they didn't know, but because they wanted it to be said aloud. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice rang out. He attacked her. Another followed. He shoved her to the ground. The murmurs swelled, a chorus of voices overlapping, each one a witness, each one a thread in the unraveling of Grayson's carefully protected power. The officer's gaze hardened. He turned toward Grayson, who had pushed himself upright but said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. The evidence was overwhelming, the weight of the crowd against him. "Check the security footage," the officer ordered one of his subordinates. "I want to see everything." Grayson flinched. He knew what they would find. He knew there would be no rewriting this story, no twisting it into something that fit his version of events. Justice was not blind tonight. Emily inhaled deeply, the air sharp in her lungs. She was safe. But more than that, for the first time in a long time, the city did not feel quite so indifferent. Because tonight, someone had finally seen. The street was awash in flashing blue and red, the rhythmic pulse of sirens reflecting off the wet pavement like ghostly warnings. The hum of the city, which had for a time faded into the background, surged back to life in the form of murmuring voices, the crackle of police radios, and the distant honking of impatient drivers forced to reroute. The air smelled of exhaust and damp concrete, mingling with the electric tension still hanging over the scene. Emily sat on the curb, her body still trembling from the adrenaline that had yet to fade. She pressed a palm to her stomach, grounding herself, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. The crowd had grown since the fight ended, drawn in by the spectacle, by the presence of uniformed officers surrounding one of their own. Grayson was still on the ground, his hands pressed against his knees, his face contorted in pain and anger. His uniform was rumpled, his dignity shattered, his illusion of invincibility stripped away under the unblinking gaze of cameras and witnesses. He had been untouchable once, a name spoken in warning, a figure feared but never challenged. But tonight, the city had finally seen him fall. Emily turned her head, searching for the man who had saved her. The man in the denim jacket, the stranger who had stepped into the darkness and pulled her back into the light. But he was gone. Not a trace of him remained. It was as if he had never been there at all. She wasn't the only one looking. Some in the crowd glanced around, their eyes darting through the shifting bodies, scanning the street, the alleys, the doorways. The officers, too, cast quick glances toward the sidewalks, their brows furrowed as if expecting to find him standing nearby, watching. But there was nothing. He had vanished into the city, swallowed by the very streets from which he had emerged. The realization left Emily with a strange sense of emptiness, a hollow awareness that she had witnessed something rare, something fleeting. The man who had fought for her, who had faced Grayson without fear, had not waited for thanks. He had not lingered for recognition or validation. He had simply done what needed to be done. And then he had disappeared. A firm voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Miss, are you all right?" She turned to find one of the officers crouched beside her, his expression serious but not unkind. His badge gleamed under the flashing lights, the reflection catching the hard lines of his face. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but her throat was dry, her voice lost somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. She swallowed, forcing herself to focus, to find her words. She exhaled slowly. "I think so." The officer nodded, glancing down at the way she cradled her stomach. His gaze softened just slightly. "We're going to have paramedics check you out, just to be safe." Emily barely had the energy to nod, her body still locked in the remnants of fear, but she accepted his words without protest. Across the street, another officer stood with Grayson, speaking in clipped, hushed tones. It was clear that no amount of rank would protect him now. The weight of what had happened was too much, too public. The footage, the witnesses, the undeniable truth that had unfolded under the flickering glow of street lamps, it had left no room for manipulation. Grayson's career was over. And yet, even in his defeated state, Emily saw the way his hands clenched, the way his jaw tightened with barely restrained fury. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't ashamed. He was simply enraged that, for the first time, he had been stopped. She turned away, unwilling to let him steal another second of her thoughts. The paramedics arrived, moving through the crowd with quiet efficiency. One of them, a woman with warm brown eyes and a steady voice, knelt beside Emily and gently took her wrist, checking her pulse. "Do you feel any sharp pain?" she asked, her tone calm, professional. Emily shook her head. "No, just shaken." The paramedic nodded in understanding, her hands moving to examine her elbow, where the worst of the impact had landed. There was a deep scrape, darkened with dirt and dried blood, but nothing appeared broken. "You're lucky," the paramedic said softly. "It could have been much worse." Emily knew that. She had seen how close she had come to something far more terrible. The paramedic finished her assessment, giving her a reassuring nod. "We'll clean this up, but if you feel any dizziness or pain later, make sure you see a doctor. And if anything feels wrong with the baby, don't wait to get checked out." Emily placed a hand over her stomach again, feeling the steady warmth beneath her fingertips. "I will," she promised. The crowd had begun to thin, the initial shock of the scene fading into the ordinary hum of the city. People had recorded what they needed, whispered what they had seen, and now, slowly, they were moving on. But as they left, they carried something with them. A story. One they would tell again and again. A story about a cop who had abused his power and had finally faced justice. A story about a man who had appeared out of nowhere, who had fought without hesitation, who had disappeared without a word. And that was how it would spread. Not just as another piece of urban legend, but as something real. A reminder that even in the depths of the city, where corruption thrived and fear silenced those who wished to speak, there were still those who would not stand by, those who would act, those who would not wait for permission to do what was right. Emily watched as Grayson was finally led toward one of the police cruisers. His face was pale with barely restrained rage, but there was nothing he could do. The weight of the night pressed down on him, on the choices he had made, on the consequences he had never thought he would face. She turned away before they closed the door behind him. The officer from before returned to her side, his expression unreadable. "Do you know who that man was?" Emily hesitated. She didn't know his name. She had never seen him before tonight, and yet she felt certain that she had always known his kind. "No," she said finally, "but I don't think that matters." The officer studied her for a moment, then nodded. It was an answer that felt more truthful than any name could have been. As she was helped to her feet, she cast one last glance toward the street, half expecting to see him standing there watching. But of course he wasn't. The night had swallowed him whole, just as it had done before, just as it would again. And somewhere, in another part of the city, in another darkened alley where someone else might be crying out for help, he was already moving toward the next fight. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out our other videos for more gripping content. Share this video with your friends and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.